And go. There we go.
There we go.
This is Reboot Ed, the show where we talk about big ideas and issues in education and hardly ever come up with any answers. I'm Andrew Schwab, your host, and I am joined, as always, by Dr. Mike Vollmert. Hey, Dr. V.
Hey, everyone.
How's things going in your part of the world?
It's freezing cold here, but it's clear and sunny, so we're happy. And we're really excited today. We've got Ewan McIntosh from Scotland, where it's not 8 in the morning. It's more like 4 or 5 in the afternoon, Ewan?
4 o'clock in the afternoon, equally cold, I think, freezing cold, and
Okay.
also very dark. It's just become nighttime, so I'm sorry for the rather somber video that we have tonight.
No worries. Thank you very much for joining us. You've got a fascinating background, and maybe you can talk a little bit about it. You started off as a foreign language teacher in, I think it was French and German?
That's right. I mean, I started out as a French and German teacher, probably undecided still. I graduated with one of these degrees that makes you totally unemployable in law and languages, and so I went off to live in France and met a wonderful girl who is now my wife, which was the greatest achievement of my time in France, I think. But I really didn't know what I wanted to do. Certainly didn't want to become a European lawyer. So at the time, the teaching profession was changing in Scotland, and I think I'd resisted being a teacher because I'm from one of those families where my mum and dad, the grandparents, the great-grandparents, and going all the way back have all been teachers. So, of course, the last thing you want to do is become a teacher. And I eventually dragged my then girlfriend back to Scotland and did become a teacher and never looked back. But in the schools that I ended up working in, they were truly comprehensive in the real sense of the word, and that we would have, children. The gag would be, we send one child to Oxford every year, and we send one child to prison, and everything in between. It's a little bit unfair to brush it with that stroke, but it was beautifully comprehensive. Every school that I worked in, and to engage these children in learning a language when they may never go to the country it's spoken in, where the inherent interest just wasn't there, or maybe rather the extrinsic interest wasn't there really for them. They didn't care. We had to find an intrinsic motivation for them, and we had to get that out of them. And so I often use technology as a hook, certainly, but also to give meaning to why they were learning the language. So we were amongst the first in the world to use blogs for learning. We were the first high school in Europe to podcast, and all of this was with a view towards giving my students a real reason to connect in a foreign language and to understand foreign cultures, rather than just the daft textbook examples that they would work through had we gone down that route. And that was the point where my career started to wave a little bit all over the place. I worked for the government for 3 years on 2 or 3 quite large national programs to engage teachers more in use of technology for learning. Some of them were really successful, helping communities connect who hadn't connected before, and getting more teachers sharing in some local authorities than you could ever imagine, really. In the space of 8 months, we had over 60% of one particular school district of teachers sharing every week something that they were doing in class. And even today, I think most school districts would struggle to put that kind of number on things. And we had remarkable failures as well, in that the big national technology programs that were taking place at the time, and my job as national advisor was to advise on where these might go. Everything in the real world seemed to be running counter to what strategy and policy was saying in edu world, which made me both incredibly unpopular. You can run a search in my name in various newspaper articles if you want a good giggle. But it also made life very frustrating for me. And so I ended up thinking I was leaving education and went off to work for a TV station instead, investing in digital products and services that went along with public service broadcasts.
Well, you had several startups. I mean, you were sort of a financing arm, I guess, for a number of startups.
Helped bring together a $100 million fund and then invest in. My responsibility was everything in the north of England up, into Scotland and over into Northern Ireland. And one of our companies that I'm really proud of was Digital Goldfish, a company that was very small and on the verge of folding in, I guess, and it was doing all these horrible Java games for mobile handsets, 2G handsets. And I remember the first time I went into the office, they had nearly 3,500 post-it notes on the wall. What on earth is this? And he explained to me that when you code a Java game for one handset, well, you have to recode it for every handset on the market for this to work. So you send this off to Asia, where it's done very cheaply and quickly, but it comes back full of mistakes. The quality wasn't particularly high, so then they'd have to debug each one of those. So I said, do you not want to do iPhone stuff? And the iPhone was really new at that point. Hard to remember that things were so new. So we invested a very small amount of money in them, and since then they've gone on to develop some of Apple's top best-selling games of all time, and have since been bought by a New Zealand game company. And we've also, I'm proud as well of service design company in Scotland that's really growing into a leader in what's service design and design thinking globally in terms of designing better government services and products. And they were my final investment when I was at Channel 4. And really the company, Notosh, came out of a frustration with education's people bashing teachers over the head, saying, be more creative, have more creativity in the curriculum. Politicians putting these hugely weighty curricula on top of teachers that seem to be a kind of a dichotomy, and nobody explaining how you reconcile the two. And of course the creative industries reconcile the two. Highly creative, disruptive, coming up with ideas that people didn't even know they wanted, but still having to have a business model, still having to wash their face and pay their way. And that's the same, I think, as a creative classroom where kids still achieve the best possible grades in their AP biology.
Well, I think, you're being extremely polite, in my opinion, when you say that the dichotomy existed between people telling teachers they needed to be more creative and the government saying, here's the curriculum that you have to deliver.
Yeah.
I mean, frankly, that curriculum, at least here in America, the standards-based movement, pretty much sucked the lifeblood out of what teachers could do in the classroom, because it became virtually endless rote memorization and just regurgitation of stuff that the teacher would present in a direct instruction mode. What I'm really interested in talking to you about is the antithesis of that, which is the basis of, I think, your organization's work with teachers now and design thinking. You gave a TED Talk, I think in 2011. And there were a couple things that you said in that struck me that I was hoping we could talk about. The first one is, you talked about the difference between what we have in the classroom as a general construct and what happens in the real world. And you made a comment that the most creative people in the UK, when they're trying to solve problems, about 1% of their work results in solutions.
Yeah.
And nobody...
It's one of those... it's an interesting statistic, because people in education normally gape in horror at the idea of a 1% success rate in anything. But the point in that very short talk that I probably didn't make as clearly as I have done since is this notion that, it's a 1% success rate, but normally that 1% has gone through the ringer several times already. Really, the point is that the final summative test is always a winner if you've managed to build so many prototypes over time and had so much feedback from your commissioner or your investor or your peers or your community that helps steer your idea towards a more successful resolution. So you show your work early. It's actually very rare for entrepreneurs, even tech entrepreneurs, to really keep their ideas secret. Normally they share within their own industry. I'd say that the sharing is even a lot more than the average educator shares, and that's horses for courses. I mean, there's some countries, for example, United States, Australia, you see a lot of teachers share. You go to a country like Sweden, where I've just returned from, and sharing there is not something people are in the habit of doing. In case what you're sharing is not good, in case people say, well, I don't know if that's good practice. You know, why are you sharing that? So there's an inherent fear of failure in sharing, and a desire to always be right. And of course, the danger with trying to always be right is that you only ever get one chance to succeed. Where you have a prototyping culture, that chance is multiple. It could be double figures. You could have 20 chances, 30 chances to get it right. So when we work with schools, funnily enough, most schools we work with aren't just standards-based, they're incredibly standards-based. We work with some of the best international schools in the world, where standards-based is not a dirty word. The reason we have standards is because it helps put a line in the sand as to whether we are performing roughly where we want to be or not. Are we progressing roughly where we should be or not? The problem is how you approach them. And when the summative assessment is how we begin the learning, then we've just killed any notion of curiosity on the learner's part, because the answer's kind of like telling the punchline of the joke before you've told the joke.
Yeah.
There's no sense of discovery, and there's no sense of entrepreneurialism, as in I have a choice as to where I'm going to take my learning. That's what I mean by entrepreneurial learning, not little business people. I mean youngsters able to make a decision about what they're going to do. And that helps them answer a really important question, which is, why am I learning this? One of the challenges I give to teachers in any school, whether they are standards-based or whether they would even profess to be, we do problem-based learning or we do challenge-based learning, my challenge to teachers is ask a dozen youngsters why they are learning what they're learning. And very often, even in classrooms which purport to be student-led or problem-based learning, the why is missing. And so with when we look at some problem-based learning, and this has been pointed out to me before, that there's problem-based learning and there's problem-based learning. But most of the PBL I see, we see these so-called essential questions, and I fear that in the planning we've really forgotten what half of an essential question is. Half of it, sure, is it essential to the curriculum? Is it essential to this body of knowledge that I want the young person to know about? But the other essential is essential here. Does the kid give a damn? Is it actually important for the youngster to learn this? And if we as teachers can't say that without grinning, then the kids sure as hell won't care that much about it either. And really the starting point for engagement and for young people to be able to take a little bit more control of their learning journey is they have to understand why they're doing it in the first place. And doing it for the test is not enough.
Yeah, we've just started the conversation here in my district and in many districts, at least in our part of the state, in moving towards a more project-based or inquiry-based mode of education, kind of moving away from the old standards-based curriculum. But one of the things that you pointed out, and that I see even in our conversations in this district, and it was your comment that prompted me to have a different sort of conversation with our teachers, is that the problems that we're looking for are sort of spoon-fed to the kids with the idea that there's already a solution out there. And the message to the kids is, don't worry about it, just go through the motions, because we're going to tell you what the right answer is at the end of this.
We're asking them to be, we're asking the kids to be computers. Here's the answer we want. How are you going to get there? And I think Conrad Wolfram really sums that up best, looking at mathematics, where he quite rightly points out that most mathematics in school is not mathematics, it's computing. We're asking youngsters to compute, which is daft, given we have computers that can do that. And really, if you learning to think like a mathematician is wholly different, and relies much more on the divergent thinking that we're talking about. But I think an important distinction that we, and I'm very pedantic when it comes to which words we use to describe what things, but doing this helps us, I think, really understand what it is we concentrate on. The curriculum has, I think, little to do with how we go about it in the classroom. And I think that we can very often, particularly in North America, I see teachers confusing the two all the time. They assume it's one and the same. We have even the words we use, instructional, the word instruction to talk about teaching is very American. You don't really hear that anywhere else. The notion that learning can't happen unless there is instruction. And teaching is a lot richer than instruction. It involves lots of other things where you're not instructing anything. Instruction also implies that there is a list of instructions. One follows through as a kid, you know, and you will find the answer as long as you do what the instructor tells you. That's what we do when we're learning how to drive, you know. What the difference we make is with design thinking, I guess you've got the planning element, which is related to the stuff you want to learn, which is what curriculum is, along with the skills that you're going to need to learn it, which is also part of curriculum. But how you go about helping the young person explore that is pedagogy. It's really the cut and thrust of the classroom. And we often find that when we start with a school or a district on a long program, most of our work is at least a school year, to give teachers a chance to experiment and test ideas out. And that time allows us to take 2 days at the beginning of a school year. One day we look at the language of design thinking, often as a common process, a common language, a common process for thinking through learning, and for showing which parts of teaching are currently owned by the teacher and which parts of learning are currently owned by the learner. And we explore how, using design thinking, we can transfer all that process of learning back to the student. But the second day is often based around formative assessment. That means that the capacity of children to share with the teacher learning objectives and success criteria, the capacity of students to be activated as resources for each other, the ability of students to know where they are with their learning, what they've learned basically, and where they're going to go next with it, and above all, the ability for youngsters to become owners of their own learning, to be able to direct where their learning is going. And to do that, you need to have a wide toolbox of skills and strategies, both as a teacher that you direct, but also ones that you can teach your children to use. And the minute you start getting into that discussion in a school, in a K-12 independent school, or in a school district where you're working between elementary and middle and high schools, the big question is, how do we guarantee some kind of progression so that a kid in grade 6 goes into grade 7 and the teachers in grade 7 know the thinking skills that this child can put to use as much as they know what bits of mathematics they covered in their course.
So there has to be some sort of common language that various grade level teams, for example, or schools within a district, or the leaders at each school site working with their teaching staff have to communicate that. You've got a section on your design thinking website that talks about a solo construct for students to be able to monitor and have a common language about how they perceive what their learning looks like. But what sort of common language is there, or what constructs do you talk about with respect to teachers and, say, administrators to make sure that the progression happens the way that everybody agrees it should?
Well, I think the first thing is we tap into the tactics that teachers already employ in the classroom to help students elicit evidence of their own learning and to help teachers elicit evidence of learning. Those are the two prongs, I guess, that we look at. Teachers in schools, when they sit around a table, you put 6 teachers together, they can learn so much from each other's tactics, particularly if you put a high school teacher with an early years teacher or elementary with a middle school teacher across those ages and stages. But the word tactic for me implies that it is shorter term. It is a tactic you can take out the box and use. So 2 stars and a wish in order to elicit feedback is a tactic. It's not a strategy. Solo taxonomy is another tactic. It's a big, heavy tactic. It's one that demands quite a lot of preparation to use well. But the solo taxonomy does allow youngsters to have a deeper way of explaining where they are in their learning and where they might need to go next. But in terms of an overarching strategy, if you're talking about a school, if you're talking about one school with 160 faculty, or if you're talking about a school district with 15,000 or 1,500 teachers in it, then you need a much simpler way of talking about the process of learning. And now we've used design thinking purely because half of our work is not in school. It's with creative industries that use that language. And for us, it's the natural language we operate in. So when we talk to our teachers in, say, the American school in Japan, and we talk about immersion, they know that we're talking about this rich, immersive first chunk of learning where young people are often independently and collaboratively examining resources, having common experiences. They're trying to work out what elements go with one another, and that's when they start to move into synthesis. I can tell a teacher, even though she's 9,000 miles away, it feels like you're moving towards synthesis a bit too quick. I don't know if these youngsters have had enough time to get, to go deep into the resources that you've provided. And it's a shorthand that allows us to really clearly and quickly and efficiently describe what we expect at different points in learning. It also means we can take all those existing tactics of teachers and start to understand where those tactics work best. And there are, when you're prototyping, another design thinking element, really strong element, is prototyping your thinking. And that might mean using, as I'm doing at the moment, using Scrivener to chunk a very, very long form piece of writing into short segments that can be fed back upon instantly and frequently, so that instead of writing a whole book and sending that off to an editor, we're writing 100 words and that's getting edited, and then the feedback from that helps improve the next 100 words. Or it could be prototyping in the maker sense of the word, which is incredibly popular, I know, as well, with increasing numbers, where you literally construct your thinking. But the shorthand of language allows us to eliminate confusion, ambiguity, and allows us to really cut to the chase and explain whether something is working well or not well, whether you're, what is the point of your activity in learning at this moment in time. It feels like a prototyping activity, but the kids haven't yet gone through their immersion. A typical example would be a modern languages classroom, where if kids are forced to speak too soon in a foreign language classroom, it can be damaging to their progression further on. It can develop, nervousness about talking, because the only times you've ever talked, first of all, you can't really say something out which is as cognitively interesting as your 14-year-old brain is, because you've only been learning the language for a year. So, by saying to students, no, you can immerse yourself, you can read and view and experience the language for a much longer period of time, and steal that language, so that when you come round to prototyping it, you can try out what you've stolen, what you've overheard, what you've read. And so we give activities that have taken place in a kind of ramshackle way often in many classrooms. They now have a very distinct position within a unit of work where those activities take place. And the impact has been quite significant in the schools we've worked with, in terms of both student engagement, but actually just in raw attainment being better. We've seen much better reading comprehension and even better spelling in primary school children who've gone through that approach, because they've had a longer incubation period before they've had to produce their own language. And we're working on trying to get more of that evidence from teachers shared on Google+, on Facebook, and what have you, so it becomes more accessible.
Right. Well, it sounds like you're almost having to reteach teachers how to teach.
I don't know
in a sense, and
it's kind of that, but so much of the tactics we're talking about are actually tried and tested. The reason we don't we don't undertake huge amounts of research. We don't do the kind of research that people often think we should. Where's your A/B test? Has this been independently verified? We don't do it because someone else has done it already. We have the John Hatties, we have the Dylan Williams, we have the Guy Claxtons in this world. What we're trying to do is translate that into practices that work across the board, or at least take those practices and show teachers which ones are the strongest. But with our creative bent, we're also trying to show how these fit within a creative process that is replicated out in the real world.
So basically realigning existing practices and then getting everybody on the same page to use the most effective ones. And
exactly.
I think that's an interesting, I mean, coming into education, it's interesting that from a siloed perspective, teachers can be doing completely different things even though they're right next to each other. And then having that common vocabulary and sharing those practices, you can find out which ones work and which ones don't, and then you have a frame of reference to determine that. So
It's
Definitely.
two really simple things you've just mentioned. One is, I mean, Dylan Williams' kind of easiest read research piece is 12 pages long, and it's called Inside the Black Box. And it's the idea that teachers are working in this black box, and we don't know what goes inside, and we don't know what comes out. When teachers share, learning is more innovative. There's wonderful research by itlresearch.com that shows this connection between teachers who collaborate being more innovative and having more innovation in it. But even this week's PISA results, when you look at the Andreas Schleicher's kind of explanation of the headline, what is the headline point? What can teachers learn from this? Number one lesson, schools and teachers must learn to collaborate more with each other and between schools. And that in the systems which are succeeding, that is the number one tactic that's going on. Teachers talk to each other and share what they do, and they take critique of their practice in order to improve. So they solicit critique. They want to know what can be done better. And it's still quite common when you walk into a school on a learning round, not an instructional round, on a learning round, looking at the learning that's going on, not the teaching. It's the teacher who takes the most exception. The learners in the class are quite happy to show you their learning, but very often we have a slightly put out face from the teacher who maybe didn't expect someone to come in there, who maybe didn't expect someone to see their teaching. And even when you explain, I'm not really interested in your teaching, I want to see the learning that's going on.
Right.
That's the tricky part.
Yeah.
But I think that's an important point from the standpoint that there is a paradigm shift that many, many teachers need to embrace, and that is that the vision that we see, even in a project-based sort of environment where the teacher's doing all the upfront work, they're laying out the problem, they're developing all the constructs, they're doing all of this work. And you made the point that we need to let the kids do that. The teachers need to maybe do a little bit of convergence towards the end of the project to kind of bring out some things that the kids may or may not have thought of as they've gone through the process. But the whole idea that the kids can be in charge of kind of finding the problems they want to work on, and then the craft of teaching is to bring in the curricular aspects to that everybody has agreed this group of kids needs to learn.
Our starting point is always the curriculum, so it's not, I think the way you've just described it is often the way PBL is described, start with the student's passion, then find a way to cover the curriculum. We're pretty unashamed in saying, no, start with the curriculum, that's what you're paid to do. Start with the curriculum, not just on that facile level, but also on the basis that curricula, no matter how painful they might appear, often have the scope to provide beautiful tangents for learning. They give you a foundation from which you can jump, and you can, it gives a context. Now, there are a few things that when we talk about it on our on the lab at notosh.com /lab, we try to explain some of the tactics that we use. One is the notion of a generative topic, something that generates divergent thinking and ideas, often very provocative. We talk about the breadth of resource and experience. So if you're going to do, history teachers in Japan, for example, who have traditionally done their trip to Hiroshima at the end of the school year, almost as a reward for good learning, which is exactly what we did with our French trip to Omaha Beach. It was a reward for the kids who had behaved during the year. Instead of doing that, how about that's the initial learning experience to kick off a deep immersion into the issues. And sure, the kids know very little, perhaps, about Hiroshima, about what happened there, but that's pretty much the same as the people who lived in the city at the time the thing went off. And so you can begin to get a real sense of empathy and a real sense of curiosity, a real passion to uncover why things happened the way they did, and that's your hook, your way in to tackle what otherwise can be turgid curriculum content for kids who don't really see why. So I'm not anti-curriculum. I think curriculum is incredibly useful. It provides us a really useful map, and we need to make sure our learners are equipped with their own internal GPS so that they can navigate that map. And that internal GPS for me is thinking skills and critical and creative thinking skills. That includes design thinking, tactics and activities and ways of thinking, but it also includes a lot of formative assessment type techniques that we know create a lot of impact for learning.
All right. Well, Ewan, I know you've got a hard stop, and with those words of wisdom, I think we're going to wrap up. So I'm going to encourage people to check out the Stay Curious campaign at notosh.com because it's a hashtag, and hashtags are in right now.
Absolutely.
But it looks really interesting. So I just want to say thank you very much for joining us. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
And Ewan, just real quick, you're coming to the States. Who is it that you're working with here?
So we do a lot of work at different points. Some of it's public stuff that anyone can come along to, and we keep track of those kinds of public events on our Facebook page. If you look for NoTosh Learning on Facebook, you can see if we're coming near you and pop along and learn with us and take part in one of the, maybe in a design thinking masterclass. We're thrilled at the moment in this December working with Columbus, South Carolina, looking at teachers who have great ideas for how they could improve learning and providing a kind of incubator environment for them, a real boot camp of techniques from the startups and technology and media companies we work with to put their ideas through their paces. And hopefully at the end of them it will be a little bit of a break them down and build them back up again so that they have much stronger ideas by the end of it. And looking forward to next spring hearing their pitches as they bid for investment to actually take those ideas further within their school district.
Oh,
so
cool.
I'll be talking about that on the Facebook page for sure. And you can check out the notosh.com/lab for some of the explanations of how to do the things that we've talked about today.
Awesome. And you are on Twitter at what's your Twitter handle?
It's just my name, so I'll pop that up now. So it's just at Ewan McIntosh.
Okay. Great.
Hopefully that can be seen.
Yeah,
Yes.
Absolutely. We've got it. All right. Well, thank you again. Appreciate you joining us.
It's a
very
real pleasure.
Interesting conversation. And Mike, stick around. We're going to have a chat afterwards.
Am I in trouble?
No.
If I'm in trouble, I have a really important meeting to go to. Otherwise, I can do that.
Catch you later.
Yeah,
Thank you so much,
you.
guys.
All right.
Ewan, thank you very much.
Bye.
That's a pleasure. Bye-bye.
So, Mike, we're still